So first things first, Marty, did you go over what a library is?
No.
Okay, perfect. So let's go over what a library is. What you guys have been doing most likely so far is writing all the code yourself, right? Which is good. You got to write code yourself. But when you're creating websites and buttons and inputs and forms and little dialog boxes or modals that pop up, all these things, right? Typically, what a lot of these people do is use a library like Bootstrap or Bulma or Materialize or whatever happens to be, right? Whatever one you want to use. And what that does is provide a bunch of what they call components. So for example, if we go here and we look at all of their components for this library called Bootstrap, we can see here that, they have elements or components for these alerts, right? So like if there's something wrong with your account, or hey, check out successful, if you things for buttons, right? So they have these nice buttons that have these hover colors. When you hover over them, it turns into a little pointer cursor. It turns a little bit darker, unless if it's this lighter button, then it goes darker. And then different kinds of buttons, right? So you have these ones which have a nice little outline, right? And that's this really smooth transition. Things for outlines, all this stuff, right? You could code all this yourself, but if you don't have to, why not utilize what has already been developed for you, right? So it's like a toolkit of sorts. So we're gonna go, so Bootstrap is probably the most popular one, I think, and I think it still is the most popular one. So we're gonna go over how to, quote unquote, install a library, how to use a library in your own project. It's super straightforward, super easy. And then we're gonna go into how to explore their documentation and how to use a library, because there's different libraries I want to show you guys today, because it's not just all Bootstrap. So they have, so if you go here on getbootstrap.com, I'm going to post this in the Slack as well. Wow. So you can just Google Bootstrap, or you can click that link right there, and I'll take you to this page. And if you just scroll down, you'll see installation. We don't want to do that yet. We'll get to how to use NPM and stuff later. But we want to utilize something called a CDN and plop these links in our index.html. These CDN is basically just a server that hosts files, right? So like when you go to a website like Amazon.com, you're basically getting their, their HTML files, right? These servers are set up to serve like JavaScript and CSS files and things like that. So we're gonna just plop this CSS file right here into our index.html. So I'm going to create an HTML file. Exactly. So all those links are there. Whoops, I need to make that a CSS file. There it goes. And there you go. You just plop that right there. In fact, I could probably just get away with doing that. So for those of us who are not familiar with this tag, it's a link tag. It allows you to import resources from another source, right? So in this case, we want to use some CSS that's in some other server somewhere. So we use this link tag and say, hey, we want to use the style sheet. And here is the link to that style sheet. Now I'm going to test really quickly just to make sure this works. Just really quickly. Cool. I think that works. Let's say works. Cool. So again, all I did was go to the Bootstrap page. They have this link right here, CSS only. It has this style sheet link right here with a super long blah, 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 blah. And I just plopped that right here in my head tag. Again, that's where you put all your imports or link tags. And then here in the body, I just wanted to make sure that we could see this button show up. So I made a button element and gave it these classes. We'll go over what this means in a second. It just says button and then button primary, and then it plopped in some text right here just to verify that it works. And as we go right here to a page, we see that it does work.
The CSS code that you're pasting in for the link ref, I have other values for integrity and cross origin.
You don't need that.
You don't need those.
No. Okay. So Bootstrap is super, super great. It's always a really, really good library to learn, especially if it's your first kind of introduction to using a library. And it has a lot more than just components, but we'll go over components first, just so we can understand what a library does. So let's look over buttons, right? Buttons are, we see buttons every day. We click on buttons every day, right? We know what a button is. So here we have some buttons that they have. So we say, hey, here's our button element. Let me make this bigger. So here we have our button element, and then we give it this button class. This is like a base class. And then you can give it like a modifier. So we say button dash primary. And I mean, you can see the different kinds of buttons that you can make right here, right? So if we go to our code, we can say, okay, well, I don't want this to be a button primary. I want this to be button secondary. And if we do that, then it turns gray, right? Just as it shows in the example here. Secondary is gray, and then so on and so forth. Now, hopefully we all know what classes do. They're just, when you apply a class to an element, it'll attach some CSS. It'll add some CSS to whatever elements it's applied to. And that's no different here, right? We didn't create these classes. These classes all came from this or the CSS file, right? This really big CSS file that, thank God, we don't have to write ourselves. So if we look at our dev tools, so I'm going to right click on inspect elements, and make this a lot bigger because I want you to see this. Okay. So if we click on our button element right here using DevTools, which hopefully you're familiar with, and if not, again, shout out, say, Taylor, how do I do that? Whatever. We see right here, hey, here are some styles from our Bootstrap CSS file that give it a cursor of pointer, which is why it looks like that hand. Then because we applied the button secondary class, it'll add some colors and background colors and whatnot. And then we have this base class button, BTN, and it does all this stuff for us, right? There's a lot of stuff here. I don't expect you to know what every single one of these styles do, but what's really important right now is you understand that when you apply a class to this element, it'll change the CSS that you see. It'll change the CSS that's applied to the element. So I'm going to double click in my dev tools here and change this to primary. And then when I click enter, I'll change it to this blue primary button, and we'll see that the background color and border color changed right here. And I can change this to success. Now it's green, and now you can see that these styles changed here, right? So depending on the classes that you apply to it, it'll change the appearance of it. And again, all these classes are predefined by Bootstrap, by the library that we're using. Does anyone have any questions about that so far?
styles, all the stuff about what it's called. How do you pick that up in here?
So go to your page, and then you can right click on the element, click on inspect element, and then typically it'll land in this, it'll show this inspector tab by default, but if not, you can just click on it, and then you'll see all of the styles apply to the element. And then you can also review the box model, which is what we covered last week, right? The margin, the padding, and the border, and everything else. Okay, cool. So let's look at some other stuff, right? So there's concept of cards. Cards are just this right here. So they're just a little, they're typically a white card. Sometimes they have an image right there. Is there one with like a dog or something? I know Angular has something like that. Well, anyway, so these are cards. These ones are a little bit, you know, they have a little bit more stuff to it because they're not just a button by itself, right? You have a card header, you have the card, you know, like a title, you have the card content, you have the card itself, right? You have different components, all these different classes that make up a much more complex component. So I'm just going to copy paste this here, just again, show you as an example. So if I go down here, my HTML, I'll just plop that there. Doesn't matter what it says. But as we refresh the page, we'll notice, hey, there's our card, right? So we have our header, title, body, content, all that stuff. And it's all right there. And if we inspect the card here, we notice all these styles that we didn't write ourselves, but is made available to us using this library. Now, I'm not going to go through all the different components. You can see, you know, all of them right here. There's quite a bit of them. But I just wanted to at least show you guys, this is what a library does. It creates all these predefined classes for you, and then you can plop them there and make your elements on the page look a lot better than if it was just a normal plain vanilla button. So for example, with almost zero work, we can transform a gross button to look like this, right? And we didn't even write any CSS yet. Cool. All right, so, but a library typically does a lot more than just provide, you know, these components. They'll provide some classes that allow you to format the layout of the page, right? So, for example, Bootstrap has this really good flex box grid system. Well, what's a grid system? A grid system allows you to, let's see, I think it will provide some sort of example. Okay, well, here's this. So a grid system allows you to use classes just like this to change the layout of the page very easily, right? You'll use a grid system almost guaranteed with any sort of web development projects that you use. We use Bootstrap Grid in every single web development project that we do because it's great, it's easy to use, and it works very well and it's consistent. So for example, I can go here and whenever you're, and this is definitely something that you should follow along with, this is where we're going to get a little bit more into the code. So whenever you want to use Bootstrap's grid system, you'll wrap something in a container. And let's add some lorem ipsum there. So all I did was go in my body. I created a div and added a class container to it. And then added some lorem ipsum. If you're using VS Code, which you totally should, there's an Emmet abbreviation where you type lorem and then the number of words that you want to be lorem ipsum, and then push enter, and it'll auto-generate lorem ipsum, which is just placeholder text. Or Latin. I think it's Latin. And if we look at our page, we see that. So what did it do? Well, it didn't look like it did too much, but this allows us to use Flexbox's grid system. And we'll see that it automatically applied padding to the left and right and push our content in the center, right? If we got rid of this class, it would look like this. But just by applying container, now we have this, right? So everything's right in the center horizontally. And it actually allows us to do mobile responsive design, which is incredibly important. So as we get smaller in screen size, the amount of padding applied on both on the right and left is decreased to a certain extent, and then it just stays put. Right? Okay. So there's that. Now, in Bootstrap's case, their grid system has rows and columns, kind of like an Excel spreadsheet, right? So if we go here, we'll see that we have 2 columns here, and then we have 3 columns here. But at the end of the day, their columns all add up to a certain width right here, right? Now, in Bootstrap, interestingly enough, you can have up to 12 units, 12 column units in a row. Meaning, if I go somewhere here, okay, here's this. So we see column 8. So we have a column here with 8 units, and we have a column here with 4 units. Ignore these other things right here. But we have 4 units and 8 units. And we can see that this takes up 66% of the total width, and then this takes the rest of the third. Here we have a column with 6 units and a column with 6 units out of 12. That means this takes up 50%, and this takes the other 50%. Here we have a column with 4 units, and 4 units. Right, so if we add these 4 units together, it makes 8, which is why this goes this long here. Does that make sense? So you have a 12-unit base column grid system. So let's put that into action. So I'm going to create a div with a class of row, and then I'm going to create 2 columns here. And again, abbreviations are your friend. If you want to create a div with a class, you can say div and then the class. Push enter. There you go. Super nice. You guys should really familiarize yourself with abbreviations. They make your code time go much faster. And here I'm just going to add 2 p tags with some lorem ipsum. Baloney. So here's my container. I have a single row with 2 columns. Now these columns are going to be equal length columns, as we can see right here. So we have 2 rows, or we have 1 row, excuse me, with 2 columns. And we can see that here. So if I go in our elements inspector, we see the single row, and then we have the 2 columns side by side, equal width. Important note, you have to use, in order to use columns, you have to put them inside of a row. If you do that, it'll look funky. So if I get rid of the row, it'll not do what I want it to do, right? There's a missing row class here. So, but right as I put in row, there it goes. So you have to put columns inside of rows. If we get rid of container, you'll have this nice vertical or horizontal scroll, right? The margins and how it lays everything together won't add up, and you'll get one of the most common but one of the most frustrating web development oopsies, and that is this horizontal scroll. So if we say lorem and then just type the number of words you want. So if I want 42 lorem ipsums words, there we go. Cool. So I'm going to keep that. Whoops, let me add that row back. So I'm going to keep that row there. I'm going to add another row. I'm going to add another row. And this time I'm going to add 3 columns. So I'm going to add There's that. Can I do this? No, I can't. Another div call, and then another div call. And then again, I'm just going to put lorem ipsum inside, whoops, inside of p tags here. So we have our container, we have the row that we just made. I'm just going to add another row, but this time I'm going to add 3 columns here with some lorem ipsum text. And we'll see that again, 3 columns of the equal width with lorem ipsum text. And we see 2 distinct rows. Does that make sense to anyone? Does anyone have any questions about this so far? Okay, cool. So as we get smaller though, let me get this here. But as we get smaller, the columns just get smaller and smaller to a certain extent. And then it reaches something called a breakpoint, and then it'll finally correct itself. But as you're reading, you know, your Medium blogs or your Stack Overflow, whatever's, right, your favorite blogs, it probably doesn't look like this. And they may have multiple columns, but it sure as heck doesn't look like this, or it shouldn't look like this, right? This is difficult to read. So how do you fix that? Well, Bootstrap has these things called breakpoints, or breakpoint modifiers, I should say. I'm going to remove this row because it's unimportant. Okay, so we have our 2 columns. Now, what we can do is we can tell Bootstrap, hey, when you reach a certain screen size, I want you to change the layout of the page. I want you to change how the columns behave when you reach a certain screen width. And we do that here. So we can say column, and then we can say, I want you to be column, but for large devices, I want you to use 6 units. Let's see what that looks like, and I'll explain. So I'm going to get rid of that. Is it because it's because I'm zoomed in. Okay, so here we have a large screen size. But when it reaches a certain breakpoint, it'll go, the 2 columns will now just be in 2 separate rows. In CSS, in Bootstrap, like there's still 2 separate columns, but they'll just be on their own separate rows in the order that you make them. Right, so the row itself contains these 2 columns, but when your screen is small enough, those columns will just be on their own separate rows. And that's what this LG allows us to do. We're telling Bootstrap, I want you to be a column, but when you reach this large screen sizes, I want you to actually use 6 units, 6 column units, right? Now we can get a little bit, you know, funkier with this. We can say, okay, but on, you know, I want to be a column, but for medium-sized screens and up, I want you to use 9 here, and then I'm going to use 3 here. And you can do that. So we're on a large screen right now. We're on a large screen or higher, I should say. So here we're telling Bootstrap to use 6 units until we reach the medium-sized screen, which is this right here. Then it's like, oh, I'm on a medium-sized screen or higher. So that means this first one should take up 9 units, and this next one should take 3 units, which we see right here. 9 units and 3 units. But we don't specify anything below medium-sized screens, so it'll just go back to its normal default self. Right, so it's pretty typical that, you know, you'll have, let's say if you have like 3 different, let's use their own website as an example, right? So you have these 3 columns here. Now they're on their each separate rows. But when when you go back up, there it goes. Right. That's how you make mobile responsive design using just a couple CSS classes. This takes out so much pain and trouble out of your hands. We have these guys that have been doing this for probably decades now that know exactly how Flexbox and CSS behaves for all browsers, right? And that's the thing. When you're developing your web apps and stuff, oh, this works in Chrome. Oh, but this doesn't work in Firefox. Oh, but it kind of works in Safari. Oh, but not in Opera or whatever. Or not, don't even get me started on like Internet Explorer, right? Because that's just its own nightmare. But this allows you to create your layouts and add buttons and stuff like that with a single CSS class that takes care of all your cross-browser compatibility issues that you would otherwise have to, you know, wrangle and solve yourself, which is no fun, right? No one likes to do that. That's not great. And that's that. So, and again, so you can configure, like you can nest rows inside of other columns. Like, let me make this a little bit simpler here. So I'll add another row inside of this column. Do equal length rows or columns inside of here. Right. So there's that. So again, this is a single row. Oh, I'm sorry. Here's my column. Or here's my master row with 2 columns, but in this column I have a row, and this row has 2 columns inside of it, and you can go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, right? And that's how you get these nice, complex type layouts that have responsive design, right? So if I make this smaller, eventually it'll, oh, I didn't add breakpoint stuff to it, but eventually it will not look terrible. And that's the goal. And that's that. And that's Bootstrap. So it's, right, pretty straightforward. You can nest columns inside of rows. One quick little anecdote here. Actually, let's talk about this. This is very important. Does anyone have any questions about this?
Is it normal to use just div, 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 and then give it a
Yeah. Yeah, so you'll use divs for like your layout and gridding, and then you'll plop other elements inside of those.
It's just like a placeholder. It's a class.
Yeah. Yeah, so div is just like, you can think of it as just like a container for other baloney. And maybe it's more baloney, right? Maybe it's other divs inside of that big div, right? Like Amazon, right? You have a big Amazon box with tiny other packages inside of that bigger Amazon box.
I was reading online articles that people are complaining about people that code using too many divs. Is that like for real? Like you should try and, I guess, limit the number of divs that you're using?
Yeah, so I mean, just like if we were writing code, right? Well, let me do this here. Right? So say I have my array of numbers, right? Now in my array of numbers, I could say array of numbers 0 is 1, and then my array of numbers, let's make this easier, 0, that's 1, and then that's 2, and so on and so forth, right? I could do that. But there's a much cleaner way to do the same thing, right? I could just make a loop and go on for however long I want to, right? Same thing with HTML. There's always if you're writing divs and divs and divs and divs and divs, and when it comes to a point where, like, if I open my inspector and if I, go in here and I can't, it's all the way over here because it's nested so deep, it's probably time for you to evaluate, am I doing this in the best way possible, right? So I don't know of an example. I can try to see here. Maps tend to kind of suck. div, in a div, in a div, in a div, in a div. Oh, it's not even that bad. Yeah, but so let me, I think that's as deep as it goes. That's not even that bad. I thought it was going to be a lot worse. But so typically, if you have too many divs, typically it's like, you know, there's a better way to add markup, right? Because every time that you add an element, you're slowly making your job harder, right? Because eventually, like, oh, I'll have to add this button, or this, you know, this layout doesn't quite work on a small phone or something, and you have to go in and then you have to look at it and be like, oh god, like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I was trying to do some of the projects on Code Camp of like staying away from divs, and oh my god, it's so hard.
Yeah, it's okay to use divs, just don't use too many, right? And if you need to set up like certain limits for yourself, that's also okay, right? In VS Code, you can check the column number, right? So right here, so here's column 1, 2, 3, blah, 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 blah. And if you find yourself, oh, I'm on column 60, right? Maybe that's like, no, stop, you know, rewrite it, maybe make another component or another HTML file or something like that, right? And you can figure out what that looks like for you. And when we get into Angular, like that'll make that problem much easier, right? Because Angular allows you to, you can think of it as like embedding HTML files in another HTML file, right? Making your code much cleaner. So
The divs are okay.
divs are okay. Just don't go crazy. If you can help it. All right, cool. So there's that. Now oh, that's right. I wanted to go over some utility classes that Bootstrap offers. So a utility class, you know, think of it like a utility knife, right? It's a little thing that you keep in your pocket or your backpack, and it serves as like a little helper with, you know, day-to-day tasks, right? Maybe you need to open a bottle or open up a thing, or, you know, cut something open or whatever it happens to be, right? It serves as a small, convenient utility to help you out with just mundane day-to-day things. And Bootstrap is no different. It's than many other libraries. It provides those kind of utility classes for you. So for example, let's say I have this p tag with my lorem ipsum, and let's take a look at that. Okay, but it'd be nice if I had some padding on the top, right? So, well, I can do that. I can say padding top, and then give it a modifier of, let's say, 5, and there's padding on the top, right? And I can say, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or even 0 if I don't want any padding. Same thing with margin. I can say, let's look at our p tag, and in most browsers, vanilla p tags will have margin bottom automatically applied to the element, as we see, as we see right there, right? We didn't add margin to the p tag. It's just, it's already there, right? It's like buttons, right? If I go here and I add a button that says gross, right? I don't add styles that, you know, make it look like I'm actually clicking a physical button, right? That's just part of Firefox, and this will look much different in Chrome and Internet Explorer and so on and so forth. Same thing here. So Firefox will apply 16 pixels of margin on the bottom of my p tags, no matter what. And this is not always what you want. So rather than create another class just for your p tags or give it an ID or anything else, or inline styles, God forbid, you can go here and say margin bottom 0. Just like that. And, oh, hey, look, there's no more margin bottom. There's nothing there, right?
What you could do is but yeah.
Well, that is a class. So, and that's the thing, right? You can make the class yourself, or you could use a library that has predictable naming conventions that's consistent through your entire website or your app. And there you go, right? Something a little bit more meta to think about too is right? The size of your apps matter, right? When you're out in the Wild West or out in the mountains, because California, and you have a weak connection, right? Every byte counts, right? So if you're making your web app or your mobile app or whatever, and you have Bootstrap styles and you're shipping that with your app, you might as well make use of what's already there, right? If you're, I don't know what a good example is. Yeah, I can't think of a good example. But, oh, it's like, oh, I have a pickup truck, a long bed pickup truck, but I want to carry something in a bed, so I got a trailer to attach to my pickup truck. Well, you already have a pickup truck with a long bed. You could just put your stuff in there rather than attach a trailer and put your stuff in there. You know what I mean? It's just dead space that you're hauling for no reason. So you might as well use what's already there and use these little utility classes. Bootstrap has other utility classes too. So I can go here and I can say width 100%. So we see that gross button, just even grosser than it was before. We can add as many as we want. You can say margin top 5 or 3. There it goes. We can give it some more padding. So padding 5. Beautiful. Oh, if you don't add a modifier, right? This will do padding all around. This will do padding top, padding bottom, padding left, padding right, padding X, so on the X axis on the horizontal. So that looks like that, because I mean and you can see the purple boxes. Or you can do padding Y for the Y axis, the vertical, and that's what that looks like. Or all around, which is just 5. Right? It's a big gross button. It's convenient. It's a convenient and gross. Yes, accessibility is important, which is something that we will talk about later. All right, so let's talk about other things. So let's say I have this gross button. All right, now I'm going to apply some inline styles, which you never do. Please. Or wait, oh wait a minute. I think Bootstrap has some. Oh, look at that. Bootstrap has a background utility class called BG for background. I haven't used Bootstrap utility classes like this in a while, so I forgot that was even a thing. And then I'll go here. I'll say style equals height is 300 pixels. Cool. Now, Bootstrap has utility classes to help us with our Flexbox styles, right? So we don't have to go in and style each element one by one, right? So we can just as easily, well, let's say we want to center this right in the middle. Well, we can do that. So we can say display flex to give us flex, behaviors. Then we can say justify content center to plop it in the center. Oh, that's disgusting. I don't know if this works. Okay, I'll say style height fit content 20 pixels. All right, that works. All right, so there's our button. And so justify content, as a quick refresher, justify content is for the horizontal alignment in Flexbox. If you want to do the vertical alignment, you do what? Beautiful. Align items center and plop. If we want to do it on the bottom, again, it's flex end, so it's align items end. I'll do that, so on and so forth. That is a great and wonderful question. I'm going to answer that with another question. Let's do this. So I'm going to get rid of everything. All right, I'm going to have this that says hello, or I'm going to say no. Lorem ipsum. That's boring. Forward focus. And then let's add some styles here. Now I'm going to add and anyone who already knows this answer, has seen this, be quiet. So I'm going to have this red style, red, and I'm going to have this blue class, which will make it blue. Now I'm going to go here, I'm going to say red, blue, and then I'm going to go here and say blue, red. Now, by a raise of hands, who thinks this will be blue? This one. Who thinks this one will be blue?
Will it be blue or red?
Now, who thinks that will be red? Who has no idea and then just doesn't want to raise their hand? No, you won't. Well, you wouldn't raise your hands, but all right. Now, if that's true, thanks, Darren. Now, if we have let's say we think this is blue, then it only makes sense that this would be red, right? It's cascading after all. That means that, well, we apply blue, but now we say red. And so CSS is cascading, and we'll be like, oh, well, that has to be red, right? But, bam! What? How can that be? Instructors are not allowed to say. Who can tell me why that's blue? We just said it's red right here, and CSS is cascading, right? Haven't heard from Andrew yet. Well, both are correct. Yes. Blue is on the bottom. It comes after red. It does not matter what order of classes, what the order of classes are. It matters the order of styles in your CSS. That's what matters, right? It's cascading. The CSS styles are cascading, not the classes. So again, if we look here, we can see that it tried to apply color red. Will it tell us why? I don't think it'll tell us why. Well, we see it struck out. And no, this is just this cascading aspect. That's the cascading in cascading style sheets. And of course, if we inverse the order of these, we should expect these to be red.
What is the keyword that you use to move all that chunk of?
Oh, that was, so if you hold Alt and then the arrow keys, you can move whatever you have selected up and down. Should, yeah. I don't know if it's still Alt. I know it's Alt on Mac. I think it's still Alt on PC. It should be. Cool. Thanks for bringing that up, Marty. That was really good. Make sure you ensure that we understand that. Let's go back to what we were doing, a little jig there. All right.
So if you were to list two classes that are from the bootstrap, would it just go based on which one's listed second?
Exactly. So if we go here and we say, let's keep the height there. So if we say button and then button secondary and then button success, I've never tried this before. It'll be success. So let's try secondary here and then success. It is still success. And in fact, let's try and see if we can find button success.
So in general, you probably don't want to have fighting styles.
Correct.
You don't want to have fighting classes on your elements. Like why? Yeah. There's stuff you can do to like force one style to always have.
You can just copy and paste it into another.
But you don't
Yeah.
want to do that for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
Just don't.
You will learn that there are certain red flags that should spark a moment. Too many nested divs is a moment. When you have important, which looks like this. Basically, question mark important. I think we talked about this before, what important does. If we have too many of those, that should trigger a moment. And yeah, and that's gross. So we see here, button primary is declared first, and then we see button success over here. And then we have button warning, button danger, blah, 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 button dark, right? Yeah. Well, because it's minified. So when you're looking at your things, typically you never want to have, so like if we just got rid of the .min in that link, this is something that we can actually read, right? Which is not, thank God, because you don't want this in your app. You want the .min in your app. Any guesses why you don't, you want it to look ugly?
Because it can parse everything faster. They can calculate it a little faster.
Not quite, kind of, but not quite. So remember going back to, I think, like what we said maybe like 10 minutes ago, 15 minutes ago, like the size of your app matters, right? So when you're looking at your nice pretty file, there's a lot of new lines and white space and things that make it, easy for you to read. Comments, all that stuff, right? All that takes space, right? When you're out in the mountains somewhere and you're on your phone and you want to use your app or whatever, or when your users are over in some Wild West or have T-Mobile, you want to make sure that and that too, yes, that's actually a really good point, right? Because, and that's actually something that I had to learn, because it's like, oh, not everyone has the same set of conditions that you have, right?
Soon more people will be on the internet from the developing world.
Yeah. I think you're the one who actually told me that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was actually super interesting. But yeah, so it's things like that you have to always like account for, right? And so when you're building your apps, you always want to make sure that your files look gross and ugly. In fact, one of the core processes of Angular is called an uglifier. It makes your files ugly. So like if we look at one of our apps here, if we look at network, right? I don't know, the login page, I guess. So if we go click on this one, right? This is just a bunch of baloney, right? Gobbledygook. This copyright here, this comment copyright is still there, but probably by law. Let's look at another thing. Or here's some JavaScript, right? I can't tell what that says, and neither can you. But that's okay, and that's kind of the point. It's supposed to be ugly and gross. And we'll get into like, what if I got an error? How do I read that baloney? Well, we'll get into that later. But yeah, so that's CSS. That's Bootstrap at least, and there's a bunch of these libraries. Another really popular one is Bulma. So let's look at Bulma. This is the standard library that my team uses. We still use Bootstrap. So we use Bootstrap's grid system, but we use Bulma's components. So I'll plop this in the Slack.
And the documentation is on the site.
Yep, so right when you go to the thing, the first link right here is documentation. So just click on that. And that'll give you their documentation here, kind of bad compared to Bootstrap. Bootstrap has much nicer documentation. But for example, we can look at elements. And they have things like a box, buttons. Oh, these are really nice. These little progress bars, right? So you don't want to code this yourself. This is hard. Same thing with little progress spinners, right? That's also a pain in the butt to have to do animations and stuff like that. And not only just trying to create it for your machine, for your browser on your internet connection, but also making sure that has cross-browser compatibility. Right? I cannot stress that enough. It's a pain in the butt. That's why we use technologies like this. So steal and modify. Well, as long as it's free, don't steal things that you have to pay for, and making sure that your license allows for it. But most of the time, yeah, go for it. And things like this, Bulma actually encourages you to modify it. So if we go here to customize, you can create your very own theme with all these different variables, right? So you can specify what your primary color is, all these things, your default font size, what font family you use, all these variables. It's basically like taking a giant theme that they give you, and then you can customize it to how you want and still use the CSS classes just as normal. It's badass, man. It's awesome. I love it. It's super cool. And we use this for all of our projects now, especially because they have really cool things like, let's look at components. No, not components. Actually, this is pretty important too. A lot of these things also allow you to have things like drop-down menus, right? So I don't know if you're familiar with drop-down menus, but let me show you a normal drop-down menu. They look even worse in Firefox. Okay, option. Wow, you're gross. So if we look at this, that's gross. That's actually better than I thought it would look like, to be honest with you. It's still gross. And why is that out? Oh, is it because I'm just zoomed in? See, that's dumb. It shouldn't do that. This takes care of that, right? So we can tell it like, hey, when I click this button, make the drop down. Hey, here's a cool divider. You don't have this kind of style and flexibility with normal selects, right?
Yeah, so the rabbit hole goes pretty deep with this stuff.
Yeah.
Including animations, like the amount of time the transitions are taking, the different shades they're turning, all that stuff.
Yeah, so like this one is hover, triggered on hover. This one you have to actually click. This one allows you to go up, right? All this really cool stuff. One of my favorite things is, nav bars. When you make your own web app and you have to have a nav bar, holy crap, that sucks to do on your own. You want to use Bootstrap or Bulma or anything else, making your nav bars, making your own pretty nav bars with animation that's consistent sucks. It's really hard. From scratch is hard. Here's a button that has probably one of my favorite things, to be honest. Well, they have all these different kinds of buttons, and their buttons look really nice. And they have like these little like Easter, like hued colors, which is pretty cool. Inverted colors, rounded like pill buttons. And this one, which is really cool, is they have this like loading state. So when you click it, you can tell it to like be in this loading state using this class called isLoading, and then it'll remove all the content and just have this little content or this little progress spinner right in the center. It's slick. It's really nice. In fact, you can see that in one of our apps here. If I log in, boom, right? So we use Bulma because it's so nice. So this one's a lot more, not complex per se, but there's a lot more to it than Bootstrap. Bootstrap is definitely simpler.
Only uses JavaScript, right?
Yeah.
So how do you integrate that with Material? With your project?
That's a really good question, and something we'll actually go over when we start introducing Angular. So you can use these like the drop downs and stuff. Like they use JavaScript to actually show the drop down menu and the content and whatnot, and you can use that just as is. But when we start learning Angular, some of those concepts don't translate fully, right? There's Angular has a little quirkiness to it that you can't exactly do that. So we'll definitely go into that when we start talking about Angular. But that's good that you brought that up, though.
For the loading one, you have to set it's two different types of buttons. So one would be before the click and then one after the click.
We'll talk about that with JavaScript, yeah. So we'll probably do JavaScript not next week probably, or when do you plan on doing JavaScript? That's where the fun begins. Next week.
Probably next week.
Sick.
Next week or next week.
That's when it gets really fun, because that's when you start like actually modifying the page on your, like the content and layout and what your page looks like dynamically. So like as you type on your keyboard, as you click certain buttons or scroll around or click a button or whatever, it'll modify the content of the page. And that's when it gets really fun. But yeah, so that's Bulma. There's a couple other kind of quirky ones. Well, not quirky ones. There is Tachyons, which hats off to you if you use this. It's really, really interesting. So let's look at this. Components. So just as we saw before, they have components, right? Buttons and whatnot. So let's click on buttons. And you're probably thinking, Taylor, that doesn't look as good as before, and there's a reason why. It's because this is their CSS. That's their CSS. So F6, link, dim, BR1, PH3, PB2, MB2, dib, white, BG black. And all their it's basically condensed CSS classes, and you can check like what they mean here. So like BW is for border width. You have BA, which is a border around. You have dib, which is display inline block, and you can read here. All this stuff, which is, I get it. Companies do use this, by the way. This is a very valid option. It's just not it's not my preference, because it can get really, really messy really quick. That's actually not as bad. What's a weird, gross one? Here's a pretty good example. Like the readability is okay, I guess, but like PA4-1, PA4, BR2-NS, but this one has 2 dashes, B dash black dash 10, CF, BN, MA0, PA0, CF, MF, like what? I don't, look how long this is. That's so long, dog. That's not okay. Well, it could be okay for you. It's not, it's not my preference. Your team may hate you, but I mean, it's up to you. It's what the company wants to do.
If you condense those styles into like one style, just like have all the things in like one style,
So
one class.
yeah, so how companies do this is that, see, it's not even 1 kilobyte. It's 0.7 kilobyte or bytes, which is incredibly tiny, teeny tiny, and super fast to transmit over the wire, right? And that's why a lot of companies like to do this. So they'll configure their app a certain way to only use CSS classes that are input right here. That's what Angular does too, right? If you have a CSS class that you don't use anywhere, Angular's like, well, there's no point adding that in your app. Let's just remove that. It's this thing called tree shaking. And that's what Tachyons tries to do here. They'll create a bunch of small, tiny, well-defined classes that do a very specific thing. And that way, your app only uses what is absolutely mandatory, right? Like, as we saw with Bootstrap, if we added a primary colored button, there were like, 20 different styles there, right? But here, if we had 1 class or 2 classes, there's 4, right? And in fact, this one, yeah, there's only 4 classes. So that's the benefit. I just wanted to expose you to this because it's just another option that companies do use. I didn't know this was even a thing until after someone told me, like, I looked at their code as I was helping them with something. I was like, what is that garbage? So that's something. And then there's a bunch of these like small, tiny libraries, like Skeleton is one where it's very, very minimalistic. Their docs are like 1 page, right? So I'll just add this here too. Actually, yeah, Bootstrap, Bulma, and Tachyons. Oh, there's Material. Material is a huge, huge, it's very attractive. So if you want your websites to look like Google, you can use Materialize, right? With these nice little ripples. And if we look at the buttons, right, they have these nice little rippling effects and everything's raised and floating and looks very Android and Google-esque. So this is probably the last one I'm going to share as to not overwhelm.
Brand aesthetics, you know, the general sense or feel of the website. Like if the website feels good to use, if it feels intuitive, if it feels like invokes certain kinds of feelings from you.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of thought goes into all this stuff. A lot of time and theory and testing. So using libraries gets you to that point immediately. You can leverage all the work that's been done in the design field.
Yeah.
And you do not have to do everything yourself from scratch by hand and be forever creating buttons and
Yeah.
still looking like you're using Windows 98 or 95.
I'm pretty sure that's like an aesthetic though.
Yeah, it is an aesthetic.
In fact,
It's like vaporwave.
I think I still have this.
Hip-hop aesthetic.
Oh, do I still have this?
Cassette tapes.
So there's a nice,
Oh,
so I have a window or like a Microsoft old school Word theme. Very, very disgusting. But as you build your sites and you become better developers and wiser developers, like you would gain so much respect if you made your websites look like an old school Windows like 95, 98 website. That'd be amazing. In fact, are we going to do that?
Yeah, so the assignment should be posted by now. I scheduled it to post itself. If you go to your Google Classroom, you can see a new assignment posted.
Okay, so there's a bunch of different like UIs and stuff that we should all be able to tackle. And then a Windows 95 or 98 login screen or something that you would think is easier to make, but I reckon is just as difficult. And I think that about does it. Yeah, so just like as a quick review, libraries, they're out there. A lot of them are free. Bootstrap is super popular. This is how you import some other CSS or JavaScript into your project. You use grid system, at least with Bootstrap. A lot of these libraries have some sort of gridding system. With Bootstrap, it's a 12-unit gridding system using containers, rows, and columns, and then you can nest your rows and columns as as far deep as you want. And yeah, that should about do it.
Any questions? For the assignment, I was supposed to call for. No, you read the instructions of the assignment. You are only supposed to take one. Sorry.
So is it always okay to just use CPN instead of just set your project?
You could, yeah. So that's a very viable option. It's just to make it part of your code. In fact, we tend to do that. We tend to prefer that actually, just because a lot of our apps can be installed on the device or whatever it happens to be. Maybe the CDN is down because again, that's someone else's server. So maybe it's down or they have an outage, whatever it happens to be. So you can definitely install it locally. And in fact, I think we're going to go over that next week with JavaScript. I think we're going to talk about NPM, right? I would assume so. We're going to talk about NPM after while talking about JavaScript.
Yes.
Yes.
Whatever you say, man.
All right.
I defer to you.
We should. Yes, we're going to do that. And that's where their fun begins. Because if we look at NPM, does it tell us how many packages there are? How many packages NPM? So you have 350,000 free libraries / frameworks / bunch of other cool things at your disposal. Node modules, the black hole that will destroy your disk space.
That's 2007.
Wow, that's an old number. That's probably like 500,000. Oh, there it is. NPM passes the 1 millionth package milestone in 2019. Jeez.
All of those packages vetted for nefarious code.
No. So, okay. So that's a really good thing. Okay. So this is NPM. You guys know it exists now. So if you want to go out and, download NPM, look it up, all that good stuff in preparation for next week, I would encourage you to do so. It's free. It's great to use. Please be careful with the packages that you do download. Like back in the olden days when, the internet was a wild, wild west and you could accidentally download a virus that would destroy your computer. And then your parents are like wondering like, what happened? And you're like, I don't know. Same thing here. But this time you do know, you may have just downloaded some sort of malicious package that would mine Bitcoin and destroy your computer, or try and steal your cryptocurrency wallet information, which is a thing. NPM has now been kind of branded as like this, be careful, platform ever since there was this big scandal with an NPM package. So there was this NPM package that was really common. It was part of some other thing that people were making. And then the author of that package who made it, he published an update and then quickly published another update afterwards. And that update that was only there for like a day or so contained a little payload that when it was installed on the machine, it would essentially try and hack into your Bitcoin wallet and then send it to some unknown server, no one knows where. And no one really knew about that until it was too late. And people were like, oh God, we gotta fix that. So please be careful, because we all thought, that's a funny meme. And then it happens and we're like, oh okay.
Yeah,
That's
so
just
be careful security-wise when you use packages, when you use libraries. If you have a certain set of libraries and packages and styles and all these things specifically to use, it's good to put it all in one thing for yourself and vet all the code. And also from a optimization standpoint, only caching the stuff you actually need to use and not caching a whole bunch of classes you don't use. Do not host your projects on GitHub with the node modules folders attached to them in the future. Like, just keep that in mind. Like, don't do that. It's terrible.
Yeah.
Because you have a million packages that you're not using. You use maybe 10 of them. You just uploaded a million redundant things to GitHub. It's just,
Yeah.
So,
There was actually a worse incident where someone managed to put in an evil library inside of one of Microsoft's C++ platforms.
Interesting.
So all these big companies were just compiling this library and using the library.
Yeah. And that's really true. Like, and that's why companies nowadays are a lot more mindful of, like, now a lot of these people, like they have certain people who just manage their dependencies, like these packages and libraries that we use specifically because of that. It's like, are we going to update our, version of event stream to frickin' hack into our Bitcoin wallets? Because apparently that's a thing now. And it only happens for certain versions, right? And, big major companies like Microsoft and Oracle and Google and Amazon, they use all these third-party libraries because no one wants to reinvent the wheel. Why should they? And they build a lot of software, so they really don't want to waste all that time if they can help it. And I'm sure they are very mindful of what versions they want to install, and how they want to go about installing that. Maybe they put it into a sandbox and see what happens. Who knows? But yeah, so just be careful, guys, as you're doing that. if you want to read this, I linked I added a link to this whole like conversation, which basically unveiled that thing, and involves, I guess, 341 people. I don't know how far the rabbit hole goes. I don't know if there's like, yeah, there's literally over 1,300 comments on this, which if you're active on GitHub, if you know what GitHub is, that's a lot. That's a lot. Like a lot of these have, you know, maybe like 10, 20, 30, right? Depending on how, whatever the GitHub issue is, but this one has 1,300, over 300 people are involved, and this was a big whole ordeal, so interesting to read. And as we get into NPM and what packages are and stuff like that, it may make a little bit more sense too. So I'm going to stop recording now.